friends, welcome back. We're going to be talking about a very fun placement as a transit that's coming up, and this video will also apply if you have this placement in your chart. I don't know why I'm keeping it a mystery, but it's coming up. We're going to be talking about the archetype of connection and relationship and what happens when beauty and union enters the sign of intellect, multiplicity, exchange, and communication. You guessed it. We're talking about Venus entering the sign of Gemini. And as far as the transit goes, this transit will be occurring July 3rd or 4th, depending on where you are. And if you have this as a natal placement, it's for life. So the point of this video is, whether if it's natally or by transit, to understand the symbolic interaction and how Venus is being operationalized in the sign of Gemini. We're going to look at the psychological, the existential, the metaphysical, the philosophical, just the way I generally approach all the videos, and the mundane interpretation of what to expect, what kind of things get highlighted when we have such a transit. And at the end of the video, especially for planets and signs, I'll be touching on some of the life lessons that are coming through, either through this transit or if you have this natally, throughout an entire lifetime, what kind of themes emerge from it, and how to work consciously with this kind of an archetype. And just as a matter of housekeeping, if you guys enjoyed these kind of deep dives into archetypes, transits, and symbolic life mapping, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment, because when you do that, the algorithms know that there's something on this channel that is of value to people, and it'll help me to grow it. And by doing that, I can make more content, which I absolutely love. And the more that I'm doing this, I'm getting to connect with you guys. There are a few of you now where you come often, and I feel like I have this personal rapport with you, which is very rewarding. And I'm very grateful for you for leaving comments and sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much for doing that. And if you guys like to know more about my services, which are chart readings, courses, and ongoing counseling sessions, archetypal life narrative sessions, you can find that at parisayazi.com, or just go to the description box below and you guys can directly email me or just check it out on the website. And now with that said, let's get on with it and look at Venus in the sign of Gemini. So the primary thing to remember is that this symbolic interaction is an archetype of connection on many different levels. And if you think about it, Venus represents beauty. The ruler of Mercury, Gemini, represents organization. So this combination is essentially looking for coherence, but not in a fixed state, not as something that's permanent in its meaning. We're talking about an absolute dance of multiplicity when we have this combination. To better understand this idea of multiplicity in Gemini and this combination, I want you to think about Venus at its highest point, which is exaltation in the sign of Pisces. What does Venus want to do in the sign of Pisces? It wants to cooperate so much and harmonize so much for the sake of establishing union that becomes a kind of a merging. This is to say, the highest pleasure of Venus is when it's able to dissolve differences and to create a sense of unity with a sense of oneness. And when we think about it, what is it creating the sense of oneness from? From the multitudes, by merging them together and bringing them together. But in the sign of Gemini, Venus becomes about the interplay of the parts. It comes to be about maintaining union through differences. In a sense, Venus doesn't have the merging power that it has in the sign of Pisces when it's in the sign of Gemini, just as a contrast. It has to negotiate with many. So right off the bat, we see the highest potential of Venus has a kind of a dissonance to the sign of Gemini. And it's important to remember this because Venus and Mercury, Mercury being the ruler of Gemini, are very good friends. So it's not like we're talking about the kind of dissonance that's like pulling teeth or putting your nails on a chalkboard like Saturn and Mars together. But this is creating a bit of a friction, right? It requires a kind of an intelligence to know how to navigate and negotiate such an environment, which is what we're going to get to at the end when we talk about life lessons and some of the hardships that can actually come from this placement. When we think about it, Venus in the sign of Gemini has to kind of be okay with, for lack of a better word, life of movement. It can't get rooted. It can't root itself there. And when you think about Venus as one of her own signs, let's say Taurus, that enduring factor that's within the sign of Taurus, so we can see that Venus prefers that, but in the sign of Gemini, it has to relinquish such a state or the need for that kind of a control. if we could call it control, because Venus is not really about control. It's more about not having the kind of stability that it prefers. Venus in Gemini, we could say it's in a liminal state. It's always in a transitional state. It's in a multifocal environment. And Venus itself, we could say that it finds a sense of beauty and harmony through stability, such as in the sign of Taurus, or through mutuality and cooperation, which is in the sign of Libra, the two signs that belong to Venus. But in Gemini, Venus has to find beauty and harmony in exchange, variety, and meaning in movement across different thresholds. Because if you think about it, that's what the ruler of Gemini, Mercury, does. He is the god of thresholds, the crossing of boundaries, the twilight, here and there, neither here nor there. So Venus finds itself in this kind of environment where, in essence, Venus wants to have that kind of a security and stability. So now let's look at some qualities in Gemini that creates this kind of a mode for Venus. For one, we have to remember that the sign of Gemini is an air sign, and the ruler represents the intellect. So the sign of Gemini also comes to be about cognition, rapid firing of cognition, the way that we think. One thought just comes up after another. It's about constant shifting awareness and attention. It's about the invisible threat of relationality. It's about constant utterance of words, thoughts, signs, symbols, body language. The air, you can't contain it. It's always moving. Air has a sense of freedom. It's about transmission. In spring, it's part of the pollination process. It moves things from one location to another. Another thing that we have to take into consideration, the sign of Gemini is a dual sign. The dual signs have nothing to do with arrivals, conclusions, closures. It's about moving between things. It's about oscillating back and forth. It's about dispersing. That wind quality have that dispersing feel to it too, or function. And that dual component brings a kind of a relativism to things. It doesn't understand ontological truth. It might understand epistemological truth, but it's always in a relative term. So it's about transmission, transmutation, translation, as well as interpretation. But it's never about settlement. It doesn't know anything about unidirectional kind of a movement. That, okay, this is point A, that's point B, I just move there. It has a tendency to fluctuate and to go back and forth. And this is one of the reasons why the sign of Gemini is considered to be unreliable, because it has to do with this air quality and the dual quality that's in this sign. Another factor that comes in the sign of Gemini, this is what actually makes Gemini suddenly very unique from all the other signs. Gemini is neither male nor female. It's gender neutral. All the other signs are either gravitating more towards the masculine or the feminine principle. Gemini is kind of lingering in the middle. So we can see that Gemini does not commit. It's about polarity. It doesn't commit to one side of it. It oscillates, mediates. It prefers to observe and synthesize. And it even prefers to just mimic something rather than commit to something. So we can see that Venus can't really anchor itself to anything here. Like, it can't seek merging through constant emotional fusion. There's a consistency of emotion. And then Venus is like, all right, based on this emotion, I can merge and fuse with another person. And that's because there's never any clear cut or fixed meaning or fixed stable place in the sign of Gemini for Venus to anchor itself and to stabilize itself there. So now let's look at what happens to Venus under such conditions. The sign of Gemini has a lot to do with communication. So one way that Venus is able to merge and have that quality that is of its own essence is to find resonance through language. For example, it can have a lot of relational charisma and wit to be able to establish this connection that it wants to establish. Like, for example, in Gemini, love is not a matter of possession. You can't possess love in the sign of Gemini. And Venus is all about love. And Venus wants to surpass possession. That merging is that I even want to become one with you. But in the sign of Gemini, at best, is something you can share with someone. You can't have it. You can't merge with it. And the way Venus comes to have a lot of that sharing quality in the sign is done through speech, talking, sharing ideas. Venus in Gemini's people are very good storytellers in a lot of ways, because that's their way of connection. And they're also very good at mimicking other people, let's say their sense of style, for example, or even mirror other people's understanding, because Venus represents the five senses. So there's this acute psychological understanding about how other people feel through their body language and through their speech. They can come to even mirror it to establish that connectivity, that connection that Venus longs for. And you know what? All of this kind of sounds flimsy and whimsical. But this placement truly, because the beauty that Venus also brings, it's saying something about the sacredness of communication, of conversation, and the way talking can connect us. I don't know if you guys have ever watched that show, Love is Blind. Literally is a show about Mercury and Venus. So all they're doing is talking to each other. All they can do is hear each other. They can't see each other initially. And the point is, can you fall in love with someone if you're just talking to them? This is the signature of Venus in Gemini, let's say, or Venus conjunct Gemini, a topic for another day. But it's showing us that there's seduction in speech. There's even sexuality, sensuality in our ability to speak when you bring Venus here. Like that wittiness that Mercury would have by itself in the sign of Gemini, when you put Venus here, it becomes a particular kind of a charm through the way we're able to communicate. It can lure people in and attract through the speech. So Venus is using that mercurial quality that's in Gemini to create a channel or a medium through the speech and the ways that we communicate to create a flow of intimacy, which allows us to establish connection. This is one of the artful things about Venus in the sign of Gemini. And a sense of intimacy can come from here because Venus has that sense of reciprocity. So if you're on a date with a Venus Gemini person, they're not going to be that person who's sitting across the table, just like a wall. They don't ask any question. It seems like they have no interest in you. It's like, again, going back to pulling teeth, it's like pulling teeth to get to know them. But Venus in Gemini will ask questions. And through those questions, it has the ability to, let's say, make itself vulnerable. So it creates this channel, this back and forth that is actually intimate through speech and communication that comes out of Gemini. So there's always this participation in exchange of meaning. And honestly, when you think about it, this is a pretty good representation of real life in a lot of instances. And what I mean by this is that not just as human beings, when I look at everything in nature, is operating on the principle of relationality, relationship, and relational dynamics, which is not everything's operating on the premise of fusion and merging. Life is actually growing and flourishing based on just things coming into relation, having a connection. And from that nexus, there comes another variation, and then those variations come into relation with each other. So, and Venus is bringing a sense of cooperation, harmony, which is actually allowing these nodes of connection and communication to establish a connectivity. And you know, when we think about it, a lot of our relationships work because of our differences, not because of our sameness. In reality, in real life, it's kind of good when we think about Venus at its highest points in the sign of Pisces that wants to merge and create oneness. Great if you want to do that with a god, if that's coming from a devotional place within your heart about the ultimate being, the higher being. But most humans are not made that way. Like your partner is very likely that they don't want to become like you. You don't want to become like them. In fact, the relationship works because there's a mutual recognition that that's you, this is me, this is our boundaries. We negotiate in the middle and we make this relationship work. If you overstep that boundary and you want to merge, it can actually come across as being psychotic. So that's what I'm saying. In reality and in real life, this dynamic of Venus in Gemini, it's a great representation of how we actually function as human beings. And there's another thing too. It's very hard to find a Venus in Gemini person who becomes dogmatic because it has the capacity to hold multitudes graciously and gracefully, even when there's great amount of contradiction. It can even hold those contradictions within its own identity and have a sense of meaning and understanding about it. And that's because Gemini treats everything as a threshold between this and that. So in this sense, Venus in Gemini is safeguarded from dogma. So when we think about this, we can also say that Venus in Gemini is looking for non-traditional kind of relationships and connections, intimacy. For instance, Venus in Gemini will have a preference or gravitation towards relationships that are more fluid, non-binary in their structure, or even polyamorous. It can be. Like Venus in Gemini is not looking for emotional intensity in a relationship, but it intensely enjoys very intimate conversations. There can be beautiful intellectual exchanges. And there are some people who find that very sexy and appealing. I've heard many people say, I got attracted to their intellect. It wasn't their body. It wasn't what they have. It was the way that they could speak, the way that they could have a conversation. We're talking about a Venus in Gemini quality here. Mercury in Gemini can have this quality too, but it can have a slant more towards platonic friendships. And it can be super witty to a point that you're just bantering with someone else. But Venus, because of that graciousness, that gracefulness, that attractive thing that it has, it creates a different kind of allure and a dynamic. Another thing is like the depth of love might not have a full opportunity to express itself with this signature, but love is playful here. It's cerebral, it's curious, it's ever-changing. So there's a sense of newness and freshness that you have in a relationship because you're curious about your partner. You want to constantly rediscover them. They do something, you even know their habit, but then because there was that variation and that little bit of change, you're curious, well, why does he or she or they, why do they do that under that situation? So you don't lose interest. And the air element of any sign has to do with a sense of freshness, that breeze that comes in, especially in the sign of Gemini, because it represents the spring, that beautiful spring breeze that brings the scent bearer. So there's always something new to discover. You can be surprised with this kind of a placement. Another way to think about this signature is that Venus in Gemini treats union as a kind of a network, not a singular point, like the way it does in Pisces. Venus in Gemini is a kind of a pollinator rather than a possessor, as I was mentioning before. It's about spreading beauty, attention, affection across many different nodes. It's like the prana, the air that we breathe. It touches all these different meridian points throughout our body. It doesn't have an aim that I'm just going to go from here to there or I'm just going to stay here. It has a spreading quality. It's infectious in a beautiful way. And then there's another quality in Gemini. It's very youthful. The ruler is youthful. The sign of Gemini is youthful. And what does that mean? There's a sense of lightness to it. There's playfulness again. So Venus in Gemini is very much focused on joy, wit, curiosity, and it has a lot to do with spontaneity. For the sake of pleasure, it wants that kind of a pleasure. There's another beautiful thing in Venus in Gemini. They can be very apt at speaking in metaphors. It's like the muse is speaking to you through metaphors. You know how some artists say like so-and-so is my muse? The muse could be that Venus in Gemini person. They can send messages of love. You know, Mercury is considered the messenger. This is the sign of Mercury. Gemini is about communication. We're constantly sending messages to other people. But Venus's messages are charming, whether if it's in a body language, a glance, or the kind of word and the kind of metaphor that it uses. It lures you in and it attracts you. Affection is general, is communicated. It's not emotionally demonstrated. It's spoken. Like Venus in Gemini has the art of how a relationship can be light and playful, but still real. It can be temporary, but still sacred. That duality that's in the sign of Gemini, right? It can be impermanent and it's still beautiful and as grand as anything that's permanent. It just has a different way of loving because it has a different way of feeling and thinking in the sign of Gemini. You know what its love is like, Venus in Gemini? I don't know if you guys have ever seen this. If I find the clip, I'll put her on the side in this new location. I don't know which side the screen when things go up. But the Buddhist monks make these sand mandalas and they start making them early in the morning. They do their rituals and their prayer. And then throughout the day, just with the movement and the motion of the day, the entire artwork dissipates. It's gone. So it's the most beautiful piece of art that is temporary, but it's just as sacred as if it was carved on the side of a mountain. For Venus in Gemini, love is about exchange. It's not about sustainability of things. This is one of the things, one of its beauties, and as we'll see, one of the things that brings a lot of hardship for this placement too. It also shows us how beauty can emerge from interplay of minds. It can come from thoughts, and things don't have to be tangible. It shows us how much beauty can come from multiplicity. Like when we look at individual expressions of arts, yes, of course that we see beauty, but when we look at our cultural production, which is the meeting of many minds, in a very abstract way, interacting and creating the kind of beauty that we can create, like civilizations. We're talking about interaction of multiplicities. For Venus in Gemini, love moves like the way air moves. It's something that's shared, it gets passed on. It's not something that's held down or kept. And pleasure always comes from variations and not necessarily from depth or long duration of things. Another beautiful thing about Venus, because of his reciprocal nature, is that Venus in Gemini, and especially because it's in a communicative sign, is telling us what it means to have shared recognition, how to be seen, how to be heard. And this is so important. I mean, being a human being, I mean, in a lot of sacred scriptures too, this is also described as the nature of God or the higher being. It wants to be loved. It wants to be witnessed. It wants, in every religion, there's a tradition of praising God, and that pleases God. For us human beings too, we want to be perceived through another person's gaze. We want to land somewhere, and then we want to know that we've been understood. Venus in Gemini has a keen ability to do that for other people because of that reciprocal nature, because of the feminine principle that's related to Venus, that is about taking in, holding, nurturance, caring. And in the sign of Gemini, it can use the communication mode to either transmit this or be the place where it's getting the transmission. So this is one of the beautiful things about this sign. So now we talked about many of the qualities, and there are much more, many of the qualities that are very beautiful about this sign. But let's now get into some of the shadow aspects.